The holo feed did not carry the sound of 71,000 people turning to ash, which made the silence in the apex spire infinitely worse. Sub-Prefect Zal stood in the upper tier of the assembly hall and watched the feed die. One moment, the orbital band around Oakhaven showed a ring of white light, medical bays, tether arms, 12 generations of careful construction. Then the light was gone. The feed went to static, and the static went to nothing, and First Speaker Orox was already moving on. "The tariff violation has been resolved," Orox said. He had the deep, unhurried voice of someone who had never once needed to raise it. His iridium cowl caught the hall's blue light. His skin, pale, bloodless gray, showed no change of expression. He smiled with only the bottom half of his jaw, the way a Zathrian smiles when something is beneath consideration. On the floor below, Commander Jada Wren stood at the address plinth. She had been standing there for 12 minutes. In that time, Orox had dissolved the station, recorded the action as a tariff dispute, and filed the paperwork. She had not moved. Her hands were flat on the plinth's edge. Her eyes tracked the empty feed. The assembly waited for her to collapse. Zal watched her instead of the screens. He was an archivist by training, and archivists read small things. He noticed that her right hand lifted from the plinth's surface for 2 seconds, 2 fingers pressing a short sequence against her own forearm, then settled again. He could not read the pattern. He filed it without knowing why. "The disarmament edict," Orox continued, "will take effect within 1 standard cycle. Earth's registered naval registry. 500 defense platforms will be decommissioned and submitted to the Concord's metals recovery program." He paused. "You may call it generous." A low sound moved through the hall. Not laughter. Exactly. Something adjacent to it. "The Zathrian Concord values the contributions of client species," Orox said. He had a way of saying the word client that made it sound like a quarantine category: agriculture, medical fabrication, mineral extraction. "These are noble callings. Earth will continue to serve them." Something sat on the floor near the plinth. Zal had not seen it there before. A small object, wooden, by the look of it, carved into the rough shape of an animal. It must have fallen from Commander Wren's jacket. Orox glanced at it. Then he reached out with one long jointed foot and flicked it off the podium's edge. It hit the hall floor 12 meters below and made a small, clean sound. Wren watched it fall. She did not look at Orox. She did not look at the dead feed. She glanced at the floor below, at the small shape lying there, and then she straightened. She reached inside her collar and withdrew what Sal recognized as a simple timepiece, an old one by the housing, checked the face, and put it back. Then she bowed her head, turned, and walked out. The lower tiers broke into the sound Zal had been waiting for: dismissal, contempt, the particular noise a crowd makes when it believes a show has gone exactly as expected. The 14 species of the Concord Assembly filled the hall with the sound of absolute certainty. Zal's ocular ridges, which flushed violet when data did not fit its category, did nothing at all. He was not yet worried. He was simply cataloging. That night, or what passed for night in the Apex Spire's rotation cycle, Zal pulled the human registry. It was not unusual work for a fleet integration officer. The disarmament edict would require a full material accounting. He needed hull classifications, weight tables, registered armament loads. He opened the Sol sector file and started at the top. 512 platforms. He had seen the briefing summary a dozen times. Earth's defense network was an aging arrangement of patrol corvettes and short-range interceptors, none of them built in the last 80 years, none rated for deep space sustained engagement. The Pride Armada could absorb them without breaking formation. This was Concord Doctrine, and Concord Doctrine was, in Zal's experience, the kind of thing that did not need to be questioned. He scrolled to the raw materials section. Earth's industrial import record covered 3 centuries of logged Concord shipping. He was looking for hull components, ceramic laminate, radiation shielding, standard reactor cores. He found them, but the volumes were strange. Dense core tungsten imports ran at roughly 40 times what 500 platforms would require. Magnetic accelerator components, the kind used in high-yield battery installations, had been moving through human deep space logistics corridors in quantities that Zal could not fit to any structure in the registered fleet. Thermal baffling, gravitational anchor arrays. Cold sleep provisioning on a scale that implied crews measured in the millions, not the thousands. He flagged the discrepancy, wrote a note, moved it to his personal archive rather than the shared fleet brief. His ocular ridges stayed violet for a long time after. He told himself it was a logging error. Centuries of accumulated shipping manifests, misrouted entries. Client species tended to be disorganized. He filed the note under administrative anomaly and went to sleep. He did not sleep well. Something is wrong with what you're hearing and it can't wait. Stay close, because the part that changes everything hasn't happened yet. 3 days after the assembly, Commander Wren checked out of the Concorde Transit Hub at Outer Rim Station 7 with a crew of 8 and a vessel flagged as a survey runner. Sal knew this because transit records were part of his archive access, and because he had, without deciding to begun tracking her. The survey runner filed a course toward the Inner Sol shipping lanes, standard return trajectory for a client species dignitary, nothing unusual. Zal pulled the vessel's drive signature from the nav lane registry and ran it against the hub's emission logs. The runner had diverted at the Kuiper marker. Its last recorded position was not the inner lanes. Its last recorded position was deep in the Helios fringe, the frozen outer band of the Sol system, past the gas giants where the dark matter concentration was dense enough to play games with standard detection arrays. Zal noted this. He also noted that the gravitational drag readings from the Helios fringe had been elevated for the past 18 months, not dramatically. Not in a way that would catch an automated sweep, but he had a careful eye, and the drag signature was wrong for an empty region of space. It was the kind of reading you got from mass. A great deal of mass, holding very still. He thought about the tungsten imports. He thought about the magnetic accelerator components. He thought about the way Commander Wren had checked her watch. He wrote a second note. He did not file it anywhere. He kept it open on his private slate and read it several times, and each time he read it, his ocular ridges flushed a deeper shade of violet than the time before. The Pride Armada left Concorde Central Dock at the start of the following cycle. 14,000 ships. They were gilded in the Zathrian tradition, hull plating finished in layered refraction coatings that caught light and scattered it in patterns meant to convey power and permanence. They were the largest military formation the Concorde had deployed in 2 centuries, and they were going to Earth to watch 500 aging patrol platforms be cut apart. Zal had been assigned to the flagship Sunspear as Fleet Integration Observer. It was a routine posting for an archivist of his clearance. He stood on the Sunspear's secondary deck and watched the Concorde's 14,000 gilded ships arrange themselves in jump formation, and he thought about mass holding very still in the dark. Admiral Vreth seven-jointed with the particular stillness of a Zathrian military officer who had never once been surprised, reviewed the Sol approach brief on the main display. Zal had read the same brief. It was 4 pages. It covered Earth's registered fleet, Earth's registered shipyards, and Earth's likely civilian response to the Armada's arrival. It did not mention gravitational anomalies. It did not mention tungsten imports. It did not mention a survey runner that had gone dark near the Helios fringe. Sal had flagged none of these things in the official brief. He told himself this was because his data was incomplete. He told himself that filing an anomaly report on the eve of a fleet operation with nothing but a private slate note and a bad feeling would mark him as exactly the kind of officer who saw ghosts in cargo manifests. He told himself this while the Pride Armada finished its jump calculations. He told himself this while the countdown reached its final measure. "Admiral," he said. Vreth did not look up from the display. "Sub-prefect. The gravitational drag readings in the Helios fringe have been anomalous for 18 months. A pause. Very slight. Solar body migration is documented in that sector. The signature does not match any catalogued body." Zal kept his voice flat. Flat was the only register that worked with Zathrian flag officers. The mass coefficient suggests a concentration of objects in the range of sub-prefect. Vreth looked up now. Her eyes were the pale gold of old amber. "I have 14,000 ships and a signed edict. What I do not have is patience for a fleet integration officer's instinct about dust cloud readings." She held his gaze for 3 seconds exactly. "Secure your station." The jump signal fired. Sal secured his station. The Sun Spear's drive core sang its deep, resonant chord, and 14,000 gilded ships bent space around themselves and disappeared. In the place they had been, there was nothing but light. The Sun Spear's drive core sang its deep, resonant chord, and 14,000 gilded ships bent space around themselves and disappeared. They came out of warp at the Sol System's outer marker, and the first thing Zal noticed was that space did not feel empty. He could not explain it any better than that. The instruments showed open vacuum. The nav array confirmed their position. The Sol System's outer band stretched ahead of them, dark, cold, lit only by the distant point of the human sun, nothing on any sensor. And yet Zal stood at his integration station on the Sunspear's secondary deck and felt, with the particular instinct of a man who had spent 30 years reading numbers that did not behave, that they were not alone. Admiral Vreth gave the order to advance. The Armada moved in standard approach formation, a broad front of gilded hulls, their refraction coatings throwing colored light across each other as they settled into the approach corridor. Zal pulled up the gravitational drag array and ran a passive sweep. The reading was worse than it had been in the archive logs, much worse. The Helios Fringe was registering a mass concentration that his array kept trying to assign to a stellar body and kept failing to categorize. The system flagged it as anomalous data, possible center drift. Sal stared at the flag. He thought about what caused sensor drift. He thought about the other thing that could produce a reading like this, if the reading was accurate, and he did not think about that for long because the number it implied was not a number he had a category for. He closed the sweep. He opened his private slate and looked at the note he had not filed. The tungsten, the accelerator components, the cold sleep provisioning for crews in the millions. He opened a new note and started writing figures, not for the fleet brief, just for himself. If the drag signature was real mass, and if that mass was structured distributed on anchor points held in stable formation, then the coefficient suggested something in the range of 80,000 heavy mass objects, not stellar bodies. Objects. The kind of objects that had drives and crew manifests and firing solutions already loaded. His stylus stopped moving. He sat with that number for a long moment. Then he deleted the note, because writing it down made it feel true. And if it was true, then Admiral Vreth was flying 14,000 gilded ships into the center of it, and there was nothing in the Concorde's tactical doctrine for what happened next. 3 light hours behind the Armada's advance position, in the dark at the edge of the Helios Fringe, the iron cradle was running silent. Zal did not know this yet. He would piece it together later from fragments. A log here, a nav trace there. The kind of record that survives because archivists keep copies of everything, even the things that aren't supposed to exist. What he would eventually reconstruct was this. The iron cradle was large. Not in any way that the Concorde's registry would recognize, because the Concorde's registry did not list the iron cradle. It did not list any of the ships around it. The dark matter camouflage field that covered the Helios Fringe's inner boundary was the most precise large-scale concealment array in human history, and it had been running continuously for 111 years. Commander Wren stood on the bridge. She was not doing anything dramatic. She was reviewing a firing solution, not reading it exactly, but testing it the way a person tests a familiar piece of work they have revised many times. Her 2 fingers moved against her left forearm in the short, precise pattern Zal had seen in the apex spire, and now, reconstructing it later, he would understand. She had been running the solution in her head during Orox's speech. She had been running it during the Oakhaven feed. She had been running it while the wooden bear hit the floor. She turned to her weapons officer. "Walk me through the drive core variants." The weapons officer, a young man named Pell, whose records listed him as a civilian survey technician and who had never appeared in any Concorde database as a military officer, pulled the display forward. "At full spread, we're looking at a 41-second window to achieve simultaneous lock on the full Armada formation. 34 minutes to completion once the pulse fires. Acceptable variance on the life support isolation, 97-point coverage. The remaining 3% are drives collocated with crew quarters. We route around." Wren nodded. "We route around," she repeated. Flat. Final. Not a question. She looked out at the dark, at the nothing that was not nothing. She had been watching a different kind of sensor than the kind the Concorde would have recognized, a passive gravity threat array that tracked mass displacement at a range the Concorde did not know humans had developed. They've dropped out of warp. It was not a question either, because humans had developed it in the dark and never filed the patent. Confirmed, Pell said. They're on approach. Standard front formation. Wren's hand found her jacket pocket. She did not reach inside. She just rested her hand there for a moment. Hold position, she said. Full silence. No active emissions. The iron cradle held. Around it, in the dark, 80,000 black-hulled ships held with it. No running lights, no comm traffic, no drive wash. Just mass and patience, and the very quiet sound of crews who had trained for this for their entire careers sitting at their stations and doing nothing at all. This is what Zal would later call the silence. He would write about it at some length in his private archive, the part that no one ever formally requested but that everyone eventually read. He would note that the Concorde had no tactical doctrine for an enemy that simply waited, because the Concorde had never encountered an enemy that could afford to. The broadcast went out from the Pride Armada at the 4-hour mark of the approach. Zal was on the Sun Spear's primary deck by then. Admiral Vrith had ordered him forward standard protocol for a fleet integration officer during an enforcement action, since his archive access made him useful for on-site documentation. He stood at a secondary station and watched the broadcast compile. The Concorde standard enforcement signal. An old form, the Concorde liked old forms. It named the relevant edict, cited the relevant article, demanded compliance within a specified window. It was in tone and construction the kind of document that assumed the recipient would read it and immediately begin cooperating. The signal went out on all standard bands and on military encrypted channels and on the emergency frequencies and on the civilian broadcast spectrum. Earth did not answer. Not a delay, not a partial signal, not a relay error. The entire Sol inner system was quiet. No orbital traffic control, no civilian channels, no automated beacon responses from the stations and platforms that should, by all registered records, have been broadcasting on schedule. Vreth studied the silence for a moment. Technical failure, she said. The words carried the particular flatness of a decision already made before the evidence was in. All bands simultaneously? Zal asked. Client species infrastructure is often poorly maintained. She turned back to the approach display. Send the signal again. They sent it again, and a third time with the window shortened. The Sol system absorbed all 3 signals and gave back nothing. Zal's ocular ridges had been violet for 2 hours. He had stopped noticing. He was watching the gravitational drag readings. The mass in the Helios fringe had not moved. It was still there, the same impossible coefficient, the same structured distribution, the same stubborn refusal to be categorized as anything natural. And now he was close enough that the passive array was giving him sub-resolution data, individual anchor points. He could almost resolve them into discrete objects. He thought about filing a report. He thought about Vreth's response the last time he had raised this. He thought about what happened to integration officers who flagged cowardice before a completed enforcement action. He reached for the console instead, not the report queue. The console's manual override panel, which gave him direct access to the fleet comm system at a protocol level that bypassed the standard chain of command. He had this access because he was the fleet's senior archivist, and archivists were given back-channel access for documentation purposes, and no one had ever expected an archivist to use it for anything other than documentation. He pulled the anchor point data. He started to compile it into something that could go to Vreth's flag station as an emergency tactical brief. Not a complaint, not an instinct, but a formatted calculation with numbers and a conclusion. A hand landed on his shoulder. He looked up. One of the Admiral's security aides stood beside him. The aide reached across, found the relevant key in the console, and depressed it. The override panel locked. A small light on the console face changed from green to red. The Admiral suggests the sub-prefect focus on his documentation duties, the aide said, and walked away. Zal looked at the locked console. Then he looked at the Helios fringe data still visible on the passive display, which had not been locked, perhaps because no one had thought to lock a passive sensor that wasn't officially connected to anything. He picked up his private slate. He opened the note he had deleted. He rewrote the figure. 80,000, give or take, based on mass coefficient and anchor distribution. He stared at it. On the main display, the Pride Armada continued its approach. 14,000 gilded ships, perfectly formed, broadcasting surrender demands to absolute silence, flying toward the exact center of the largest military concentration in human history. Vreth had not asked Zal to stop watching the passive display. He was still watching it. And at the 17-hour mark of the approach, something in the Helios fringe changed. Not on any official sensor, not on anything that would show up in the automated sweep, but the passive array registered it, a brief, tiny fluctuation in the drag signature, as if something very large had shifted its orientation by a fraction of a degree, not a stellar body. The Pride Armada flew on, and Zal sat very still, and the question that had been building in his chest since the night he first pulled the tungsten manifests finally reached the surface, and he could not push it back down again. What exactly? Stellar bodies did not rotate to face approaching ships. Had humanity been building out there in the dark for 300 years? Stellar bodies did not rotate to face approaching ships. The passive array updated 3 seconds later. The orientation shift was not a single object. The entire mass coefficient in the Helios fringe had moved fractionally, precisely, in the way a formation moves when it receives an order. Zal stood up from his station. He did not have a plan. He had a private slate with a number on it, and a locked console, and the very clear understanding that no one on the Sunspear's command deck was going to listen to him. So he did the only thing left to an archivist with back-channel access and a bad feeling. He pulled the fleet's open broadcast record and wrote a single-line technical annotation into the official log. Not an alarm, not a report. Just a note, in the dry language of integration officers, that the gravitational survey data for the Helios fringe had not been reconciled against current sensor readings, and that a formal review was recommended before the fleet entered the inner Sol approach corridor. It would take 12 minutes to route through the automated flagging system and reach Vreth's secondary display. He sat back down. He watched the approach clock. He counted seconds. At minute 9, the Sunspear's forward array registered a change in the Helios fringe's emission profile. Not a drive flare, not a weapons lock. Something subtler, the faint thermal signature of heat exchangers cycling down, the specific signature of systems that had been running cold for a very long time and were now allowing themselves to warm. The kind of signature you got from a crew that had stopped holding its breath. At minute 11, the Helios fringe went dark, not the darkness of empty space, the other kind. The kind that arrives when 80,000 sources of ambient heat and electromagnetic noise vanish simultaneously because they have all just activated full battle screens. The passive array returned a single reading. No contact. Center sweep nominal. Zal understood what that meant. He had read enough about dark matter camouflage fields in the theoretical literature to know that when a field of sufficient density dropped its concealment screens, it did not simply reveal what was behind it. It first created a brief window, half a second, perhaps 1 second, where every sensor in range reported total empty space, because the transition between concealed and revealed passed through a state that looked to any standard detector exactly like nothing. He gripped the edge of his station. The half-second passed. Space tore open. That was the only phrase he would ever find for it, writing it down afterward in the notes that would eventually make their way into 6 different historical archives across 4 species. Space tore open, and out of the absolute black came the black holes, 80,000 of them, running no lights, carrying no refraction coatings, shaped like nothing the Concorde's registry had ever categorized. Long and dark and exactly placed, forming a sphere around the Pride Armada's position so perfectly that Zal's integration display took 4 full seconds to update because the software had no tactical formation template that matched what it was seeing. The Pride Armada stopped. 14,000 gilded ships, moving on a precise approach vector, simply stopped. Drive output dropped across the formation. For approximately 7 seconds, nothing happened. The gilded fleet and the black fleet looked at each other across the dark, and Zal watched Vreth's hands on the command rail, and her hands were very still. Then she said quietly, "Weapons free." The vanguard fired before the order finished leaving her mouth. 1,700 ships launched a unified plasma lance volley, a wall of charged light that crossed the gap between the formations in just over 3 seconds. The black hulls did not scatter. They held. Sal watched the sensors register impact on a vessel in the human formation's front rank, a ship so large his display had initially categorized it as a station, and he searched the name registry and found it listed under no Concorde designation at all. Later he would learn the name, the Iron Cradle. The volley hit it across the starboard quarter. The armored sections, designated on no registry as decks 9 through 14, buckled and opened to space in a line of silent, brilliant light. No explosion, the human ship's internal suppression systems killed the fire before it could propagate. But the breach was real, and the breach was large, and the hull sections that had been there were simply gone. Zal waited for the human formation to break. It did not break. On the bridge of the Iron Cradle, which Zal could not see and would reconstruct only later, Commander Wren looked at the damage report and did not change her expression. Pell read the breach geometry. 14 officers on 3 decks had made it to seal doors before the venting completed. One had not. Wren noted the number. She would carry it differently than she carried the number 71,000, because she had sent this person into this position, and the arithmetic was personal in a way that the assembly hall's arithmetic, for all its horror, was not. She did not raise her voice. "Hold formation," she said. "Maintain firing geometry." Pell looked at her. "The starboard battery is exposed." "I know. Hold formation." Her 2 fingers moved against her forearm once, precise, deliberate. The final check of a solution she had run 1,000 times. "Tell the reserve element to close the gap and route around the breach. We do not break the sphere." The sphere held. The sphere had to hold. Break the sphere and the simultaneous lock became sequential, and sequential meant the Zathrian drives had time to spool, and if the drives spooled the Concorde's fastest ships could scatter before the pulse reached them, and scattered ships meant a pursuit. The firing solution Wren had spent 111 years of institutional patience building required every ship in its precise position, and a pursuit meant choices that Wren had already decided she was not going to make. The Concorde's crews were going home, all of them. That had been decided before the Iron Cradle's hull was even laid. Vreth fired again. 2 volleys in 40 seconds, both on the same bearing. She had identified the breach and was trying to open it further, trying to force Wren to either expose more of her formation to protect the flagship or retreat the flagship from the sphere's geometry. The Iron Cradle's reserve element closed the gap. "They're not moving," Vreth said. She was looking at her displays. Her voice had lost the flatness, not fear, something more precise than fear. Zal had a word for it in the archivist's vocabulary: category error. The moment a mind encounters a thing that does not fit any of its existing templates and has not yet produced a new one. He had been living in that moment for 2 days. "Admiral," he said across the deck, "their formation hasn't deviated." "Not one ship," she turned. "Your point. They are maintaining a geometry." He chose the words carefully. "They are not trying to win a battle. They are holding a shape. And the shape is," he checked the display, "a complete enclosure. We are inside it." Vreth stared at him. Then she looked at the tactical overlay. Then she looked back. "Full drive," she said. "All ships, full drive. Bearing 017. Break." The pulse fired. Zal had reviewed the physics of magnetic accelerator arrays before. In the theoretical literature, they were described as a method of delivering precise kinetic force at range without the plasma scatter of energy weapons. Clean, directable, adjustable in yield. The engineers who had written those papers had been describing the technology in the abstract. None of them had described 80,000 of the weapons firing at once in a coordinated pulse, because until this moment that had not been a thing that existed. The pulse took 34 minutes. Not a single explosion, not a broadside of fire. A sustained, methodical, geometric dissection, each accelerator assigned to a specific target component. Each pulse timed to arrive within the same 2-second window across the entire formation. Across 14,000 ships, the targeting solution routed around every life support node with the same care Pell had demonstrated in the firing variance review. And when Zal later went through the targeting logs, he would find that the solution's routing complexity, the computational work of threading kinetic strikes through 14,000 vessels without hitting a single oxygen recycler or thermal regulator, was greater than the drive cores, battery arrays, jump drive coils, the Zathrian ship's propulsion and weapon systems identified and targeted ship by ship in a solution that had been calculated to the level of individual component tolerances. The life support systems were not touched. Not one. Getting work itself, that had been a choice. Deliberate, expensive, harder than the alternative. On the Sunspear's command deck, the lights changed color. Drive output 0. Weapons offline. Jump capability none. The gilded flagship of the Zathrian Concord's Pride Armada drifted in the dark, whole in every sense except the ones that mattered, surrounded by 13,999 ships in identical condition. Vreth stood at the command rail. She was very still. Her amber eyes moved across the tactical display, reading the same nothing that Zal was reading, and she did not speak. Zal's private slate chimed once. He looked at it. The log annotation he had filed, the one about the unreconciled gravitational survey data routed through the automated flagging system, had just been marked as received by Vreth's secondary display. 12 minutes after he had sent it, the passive array, still functioning, since no one had thought to target the passive array of an archivist station, gave Zal a reading of the formation around them that his display now had a template for. The flag had arrived approximately 27 minutes after it would have been useful. He set the slate down. The Armada drifted. 14,000 powered-down ships in a sphere of 80,000 that had not moved. Because it had updated its tactical library in the last 30 minutes to accommodate what it had witnessed. He sat with the reading for a long moment. Then a signal came through. Not on the military channels, which were down. It came through the civilian documentary archive access, a channel that existed for exactly one purpose, which was to allow accredited Concord historians and integration officers to file contemporaneous records during significant events. Not on the emergency frequencies, which the Sunspear could no longer broadcast on, and which had never before been used to receive an inbound transmission from a human commander. Wren's voice. Calm, precise. You should be watching your assembly feed. In the apex spire, which was still lit, still rotating, still carrying the full assembly of the Zathrian Concord's 14 vassal species, the main holos feed. No different in register than if she were reviewing a materials manifest. First speaker Aurochs, she said, which had been showing the approach corridor and then static and then emergency rebroadcast signals resolved to a new image. The Pride Armada, all of it. Drifting dark in a sphere of black-hulled ships, each Zathrian vessel intact, none of them going anywhere, the gilded refraction coatings still catching the light of the distant human sun and scattering it in the patterns that were supposed to convey power and permanence. But the feed was on every screen in every Concord system, because the human commander had, somewhere in the 34 minutes just past, quietly gained access to the Concord's primary holo distribution network. And what she had chosen to broadcast on it was this, not a speech. Aurochs stood at his speaker's plinth. He looked at the feed. His iridium cowl caught the light. His jaw moved in the shape of his usual smile, and then it stopped. Zal was not in the apex spire. He would not see Aurochs's face for another 6 hours. Not a threat. Not the kind of thing the Concord's 14 species had been trained to expect from a vanquished enemy. Just the image. 14,000 gilded ships, drifting. And around them barely visible the suggestion of black holes in numbers that did not fit any registered category. The feed stayed on. The assembly watched, and in the Helios fringe, on the bridge of the iron cradle, Wren reached into her jacket pocket and found what wasn't there. The wooden bear was not with her. It was still on the floor of the apex spire where Aurochs had flicked it. And for the first time in this account, Zhal's reconstructed record noted something he had not witnessed and could not have read from behavior or posture. It was the only moment in his archive where he speculated about what a human felt rather than what she did. He wrote, she would have known where it was. She had been thinking about it for 3 days. The feed stayed on, the assembly watched, and in the Helios fringe, on the bridge of the iron cradle, Wren reached into her jacket pocket and found what wasn't there. The civilian documentary archive channel had a latency of 11 seconds between the Helios fringe and the Apex Spire's relay network. Ran had calculated this. She had calculated most things. She gave the channel 11 seconds of silence, not performance, simply arithmetic, and then she spoke. First speaker aux, her voice went through the archive channel, through the relay, through the Concorde's holo distribution network, which was still hers, and into every screen in every system that carried a Concorde signal, which was most of the settled galaxy. She had not planned for that. Precisely. She had planned for the Apex Spire. The rest was the Concorde's own infrastructure doing what infrastructure does when it receives a properly authenticated signal from a recognized channel with the right access credentials. She had Zal's credentials. She had obtained them in the Apex Spire during 12 minutes at the address plinth, while she was running a firing solution in her head and watching a bureaucrat erase 71,000 people over a tariff. She had not known at that moment exactly how she would use them. She had simply noted that he was the kind of officer who kept careful records, and that careful records required careful access, and that access had weight. "Your Pride Armada is intact," she said. "Every crew member on every one of your 14,000 ships is breathing. Their life support is operational." This was not an accident in the Apex Spire, which Ren could not see, but whose internal documentation feed she could, because the Concorde's own cameras were still running and still authenticated to her channel. Aurochs stood at the rear of the hall. He had not returned to the plinth. His iridium cowl was still. His jaw was still. The lower half of his face, which smiled when things were beneath consideration, was doing nothing at all. "You built your registry on the assumption that unregistered ships do not exist," Ren continued. "That is a reasonable assumption for a body that controls all recognized shipyards. It becomes less reasonable when the species you are regulating decided, approximately 111 years ago, to build their own." She looked at Pell's station. The display showed the Armada's drift, 14,000 gilded ships dark, their refraction coatings still scattering the distant light of the human sun in patterns that had been designed to convey power and permanence and were now conveying something else entirely. "I want to be precise about the timeline," she said, "because precision matters here, and because the Concorde values its records, and because I want this in the archive." She paused. The Oakhaven Medical Station was destroyed in cycle 399. The outer tether, where the long-term care units were housed, was the last section to go. The people there were not military personnel. They were not logistics staff. They were patients. The youngest was 4 standard years old. The Apex Spire feed showed the assembly. 14 species in their tiers. Some of them had been there for the Oakhaven broadcast. Some of them had watched the feed go to static and heard Aurochs say the tariff violation has been resolved and had noted it and moved on, because the Concorde's machinery moved forward and the machinery required them to move with it. They were not moving now. The disarmament edict named 512 registered platforms, Ren said. "We scrapped them, all of them, on schedule as required." She let that sit for 2 seconds. The edict did not name any vessels constructed outside Concorde registry jurisdiction. "Because your registry does not acknowledge the existence of vessels constructed outside Concorde registry jurisdiction." Another pause, shorter this time. That was the gap. On every screen carrying a Concorde signal, every system, every station, every hauler and diplomatic vessel and border post across 14 species of vassal worlds, the feed shifted, not to the Armada, to a list, white text on black. Human names, first and family, in the format humanity used for official record, moving downward at a pace that was legible enough to read one name at a time if you tried, but fast enough that the cumulative weight of the scroll was the point, not any individual entry. The list had been prepared in advance. It had been prepared in cycle 399 immediately after the event, by a logistical architect who had once designed the tether systems now gone and who knew with precision exactly who had been on them. 71,007 names. The list scrolled on every Concorde screen in the settled galaxy for exactly as long as it took to display every entry. No commentary, no music, no timestamp, just the names, moving. In the Apex Spire, Aurochs watched the list. What he saw on the passive display that no one had thought to lock was the Armada's telemetry, 14,000 powered-down ships in a sphere of 80,000 that had not moved, would not move, were under no orders to move. Zal, on the Sun Spear's secondary deck, 11 light hours away, would not see the apex spire feed until later, because their orders were simply to hold the boundary and let the Concorde perform whatever arithmetic it needed to perform. He pulled his private slate. He opened the note he had rewritten 3 times, the one with the figure on it. 80,000. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened a new document. Not a fleet brief. Not an anomaly report. The format he used was the one he used for the historical archive. The long-form reconstruction, the kind his section filed after significant events for the permanent record. He had filed 17 of them in his career, territorial disputes. Trade negotiations that had ended badly. A famine on a vassal world that the Concorde had technically addressed and practically ignored. He wrote in the dry, precise language of integration officers because that was the only language he had, and he started at the beginning. The feed held on the final name, a 4-year-old whose name had been in the Oakhaven patient registry and was now in the Concorde's primary trade archive, which Wren had been overwriting in the background for the last 23 minutes using Zal's credentials and a filing protocol. The Concorde had built for exactly this purpose, because the Concorde valued its records and had therefore built its archival systems to be thorough. The holo feed did not carry the sound of 71,000 people turning to ash, he wrote, which made the silence in the apex spire infinitely worse. He stopped, read it back. Left it, he kept writing. The name list finished at the 71,007th entry. And thorough systems have thorough access. And access, once obtained, goes where it is directed. The trade dispute records for the Oakhaven case, every tariff notation, every administrative resolution, every line of bureaucratic language that had transformed 71,000 deaths into a resolved filing were gone. In their place, formatted to the Concorde's own archival standard, indexed under the correct cycle and the correct sector designation, were the names Permanent Record. The Concorde's own system, its own format, its own authentication. The final name held on the screen for 10 seconds. Then Wren spoke again. The Helios boundary is now in effect. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The channel carried it flat and precise to every screen in every system, and flat and precise was the correct register for what this was, which was not a threat and not a speech but a new administrative fact being entered into the record. The boundary runs from the outer Sol system marker, 20 light years in all directions. Within this boundary, all Concorde edicts, tariff structures, designations, and authority are permanently revoked. The fleet currently holding position in the Helios fringe will enforce this boundary indefinitely. It will not need to be asked twice. She looked at the Sol system on Pell's display. The sun at this distance was a point of light among points of light, distinguishable only if you knew exactly where to look. She knew exactly where to look. Your crews are alive. Send haulers unarmed and they will be returned to you without incident. The coordinates of 3 resupply stations in the outer Sol corridor have been transmitted to your flagship. She paused. You mistook our empty hands for weakness, Speaker. They were simply waiting for the right tools. The last loop. She looked at Pell. He looked back at her, and then at the drone control panel on the secondary station, which showed a single unit in transit, a small thing, fast, already 11 minutes into its approach vector, toward the Apex Spire's public access bay. Confirmed delivery window, she said. 4 minutes, Pell said. She nodded. She turned back to the display. She did not watch the clock. She had spent a very long time not watching clocks, because watching clocks was the habit of people who were waiting for something to be over, and she had decided a long time ago that she was not waiting for anything to be over. She was simply doing the next thing. And then the thing after that, and the thing she was doing now, was standing on the bridge of the Iron Cradle and looking at a point of light that was her planet and waiting for the arithmetic to finish. The drone's confirmation signal came through at the 4-minute mark, give or take 11 seconds. Package delivered. Drone withdrawn. In the Apex Spire, the drone had come through the public access bay. the one used for diplomatic deliveries, which was not manned, because diplomatic deliveries were logged and authenticated, and required no staff, only a verified credential. Zal's credential, still valid, still authenticated. The Concorde had not yet thought to revoke it, possibly because the Concorde had not yet produced a category for the last several hours that would have suggested revoking it was a priority. The drone had placed its package on the central plinth. The Apex Spire's internal cameras, still running, still on Ren's channel, caught it at a high angle. The plinth empty since Aurochs had stepped back from it. The assembly hall, its tiers populated with the representatives of 14 species who were very quiet and very still. The wood a warm dark color in the hall's blue light, warm being the wrong word for anything in this room, but the material was what it was, and it sat where it sat. The holo feed screens, which had just finished the name list and had shifted back to the image of the Armada, and on the plinth's central surface, a carved wooden bear, thumb worn smooth on the left ear. And the tiny sound it had made when the drone placed it down had been picked up by the hall's audio system and carried through the channel, and it was, Zal would note in his archive, not the sound of a soft thing being set gently in place. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a very long sentence. Aurochs stood in the entrance to the access corridor. He had been watching the feed from there, had not moved back into the hall, had not returned to his plinth, had remained at the threshold in the way of someone who has not yet decided whether to re-enter a room. He looked at the plinth. He looked at the object on it. His face, pale and bloodless in the hall's blue light, showed the expression it had been showing since the Armada's telemetry had stopped reporting drive output, which was not anger, not fear. His jaw did not move, but the specific look of a mind that has reached for a template and found the shelf where that template should be entirely bare. He had categorized humanity for 40 years. Agrarian suppliers, medical fabricators, a docile species with no biological capacity for organized violence at scale, whose long peace was evidence of limitation rather than choice. His registry had confirmed it. His advisory council had confirmed it. The entire architecture of Concorde policy toward Earth had been built on this confirmation, and the architecture had been solid, and he had walked through its rooms without checking the load-bearing walls because the load-bearing walls did not need checking. He turned and walked into the access corridor, and the Apex Spire's cameras followed him as far as they could, and then he was gone, and the feed returned to the assembly hall, and the assembly hall was quiet, and the wooden bear sat on the plinth in the blue light. He looked at the wooden bear, and the Armada drifted on every screen, and the 14 species of the Zathrian Concorde sat in their tiers and did the arithmetic that the last several hours had given them to do. On the Sunspear, Zal wrote. He wrote for 3 hours. He did not stop to eat. His ocular ridges flushed violet and stayed there, and he stopped noticing. He wrote about the Apex Spire and the address plinth and the way Commander Ren had stood for 12 minutes without moving while a bureaucrat dissolved a station and filed the paperwork. He wrote about the tungsten manifests and the magnetic accelerator components and the figure he had deleted and rewritten and deleted again. He wrote about the annotation he had filed 27 minutes too late. He wrote about Vreth's hands on the command rail, very still, after the pulse ended. He wrote about the wooden bear, where he had first seen it, what it meant to him at the time, which was nothing, which was the point. He wrote about what it meant to him now. When he finished the reconstruction, he read it back once. He corrected 2 figures and 1 date. Then he filed it under the Historical Archive designation with the cycle and sector reference and the event classification, and the event classification he used was not the one the Concorde's taxonomy provided for military engagements or enforcement actions or boundary disputes. The classification he used was the one reserved for events that changed the structure of the settled galaxy. He had filed it that way twice before in his career. He believed, reading back the last 3 hours of work, that this was the correct category. He set the slate down. Through the passive display, still running, still unblocked, the one sensor array no one had thought to lock because no one had expected an archivist to find it useful, the Helios Phrygia was quiet. The boundary they marked was 20 light-years in all directions, and it was not on any Concorde map, and it was not in any Concorde registry, and it did not need to be, because it was marked by 80,000 ships that had been waiting for 111 years and were 80,000 ships in holding pattern, running no lights, no drive wash, no calm traffic, by all available evidence prepared to continue waiting. The sun spear drifted, the armada drifted with it. The Helios Fringy held still. Somewhere in the inner Sol corridor, on a planet that Zal had catalogued for 40 years as a docile agrarian and medical supplier, it was, by his calculation of the local time zone, the Oakhaven station had operated under early morning, the kind of early morning where the light comes in flat and cold and the day has not yet decided what it will be. He did not know what humanity did with its early mornings. He realized, sitting in the dark of the Sunspear's secondary deck with the passive display showing 80,000 black holes holding a line he had not known existed until today, that there were a great many things about humanity he did not know. He thought he would read more carefully, going forward on the bridge of the Iron Cradle. After the channel closed and the confirmation came through and the arithmetic was finished, Commander Wren stood at the display for a moment longer. The Sol system, the sun, the planet. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. Reflex, old habit, the weight that wasn't there, and this time she let it rest there for longer than she usually did. Long enough to be a thing she was doing rather than a thing she had done before she noticed. Then she withdrew her hand. "Pell," she said. "Commander. Log the boundary as active. Rotation schedule is briefed. Longed." She turned from the display. She walked toward the corridor access, past the weapons station and the nav array and the crew positions where her people were running post-action diagnostics in the particular silence of professionals who have done a difficult thing and are now doing the next thing. None of them looked up. She had not expected them to. She had trained them, and she had trained them to look at their stations, and they were looking at their stations. At the corridor access, she stopped. She turned back, not to look at the display, which was behind her. The stations and the hands on the consoles and the faces tilted toward screens, cataloging the shape of what they had built and held and aimed and chosen to stop exactly where they had stopped it. Then she walked out of the bridge, and the door closed behind her, and the bridge of the Iron Cradle was quiet, and the boundary held, and in the primary trade archive of the Zathrian Concord, to look at the crew, not 1 centimeter past the line she had drawn before any of them had taken their posts. She looked at them for 3 seconds. 71,007 names sat in the permanent record where the tariff dispute used to be, and in the apex spire the wooden bear sat on the empty plinth in the blue light, and no one in the settled galaxy, in the hours that followed, was talking about anything else.